So, hi everyone. My name is Dr. Sam Hurst, and you can find me on Twitter at RomGothSam. And you can also use the hashtag Romancing the Gothic if you're wanting to live tweet this or chat about it on Twitter or whatever your social media is. Do feel free. If this is your first time coming, you can also find us on the website Romancing the Gothic. Just Google it, it's quite easy. And we have a YouTube channel of a lot of previous classes. So some of the classes that I've done before, I'll make a little bit of reference to today. You don't have to have been to them, but it's the opportunity to things that we have to go over quite quickly. I've talked about them in more depth in other places. So what I'm going to be looking at particularly today, of course, is this intersection between Frankenstein and Milton. And because I'm me, we're going to be looking at some theology stuffs. So I've taken this quotation as the title of the talk today. So did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me, which is the epigraph of the 1818 version. And it is taken, of course, from book 10 of Paradise Lost by John Milton. I'm going to be splitting this into 3 sections as usual, and there'll be 3 question times or 3 breaks in the middle as well, which is different to the breakout rooms. Those will be an open question time. The first section, I'm going to be introducing you to some of the ways in which the text of Frankenstein uses, engages, or reflects Paradise Lost. In the second section, we'll be talking about what those reflections are perhaps doing in terms of the sort of theology and ideology that's going on underneath the surface there. And spoiler alert, I'm going to be going for everything's a bit ambiguous. And then in the third section, I'm going to be looking at some other sort of character archetypes and figures of the mortal immortal, which inform this portrayal of Frankenstein and are sort of models and archetypes with which Mary Shelley is regularly engaged. So I think that they can shed some extra light or illuminate a little bit more her use of this figure of the creature in Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So, I'm hoping that most of you have some familiarity with Frankenstein, and some of you will have a great deal of familiarity with Frankenstein. But just in case we haven't seen it for a while, or you haven't read it for a while, or you've seen it rather than reading it, and some of the kind of structures of how the novel is formed have flitted away a little bit, I'll just go very quickly over the structure. So like many Gothic novels of the period, there's a framing narrative, and what we have is sort of a matryoshka or Russian doll effect, where you go from one narrator to the next, and then sort of back out again. And the 3 principal narrators are Robert Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and his creature. So we start the first 4 chapters. We're following the story of Robert Walton, who is a young man who's had a fairly patchy education, but is filled with ardor and the desire to make a name for himself and discover something of benefit to the human race. And he's on his way to the North Pole to sort of transgress the limits of human endurance and explore there. And while his ship is caught in ice, he sees at a distance the creature going past in a sled, and then meets Victor Frankenstein, who is in distress after the ice has broken up. His dogs have mostly died. He's on the point of death. Robert Walton brings Victor Frankenstein into the ship. They become friends of a sort, and Victor tells his story. So Victor's story contains his childhood. We're introduced to his family and to his bride-to-be, Elizabeth. Then we also find out about his university career in Ingolstadt, where, of course, he engages in his arcane studies and creates a living creature. I say arcane, it's all put through the lens of natural philosophy or science, with kind of a heavy emphasis on chemistry. Then, of course, he runs away from the creature, and we find him sort of recovering and eventually going home, only to be met with the news that his younger brother is dead and that the servant Justine is being tried for it. He is very aware that Justine is not the murderer, but he doesn't really do anything about it. And then when he's wandering around in the mountains feeling sad and guilty, he once again meets the creature on a glacier. The creature then recalls his sort of origin story of sorts, what happened after Frankenstein just ran off because he was scared. And he talks about how he came to know human speech, how he came to understand the world, and particularly focuses on his time living in a little shack next to the house of the de Lacy family, who he loved and wanted to join, but who ultimately rejected him. And so he has sought out Frankenstein in part with a feeling of revenge, but to get a companion. So then we start to come out of this Russian doll sort of structure. We go back into Frankenstein's story. We see him wrestling with the idea that he has to create this female creature. And he is on the point of doing so, and obviously then rips it up because he's like, no, I can't let a race of monsters take over the earth and destroy humankind, because he couldn't think of any other solutions. And then we see the epoch or the period where Victor is chasing the creature across the entire world in this really strange game of cat and mouse, where the creature is essentially helping Victor to track him. And then at the end, we go back into Robert Walton's narrative. Victor Frankenstein dies, and Robert meets the creature, who explains his plan is to go to the furthest point of the North Pole and then set himself alight on a funeral pyre. So that's the structure of the story more generally. And what we're going to be looking at today with these kind of resonances with Milton particularly is the way in which the narrative of Paradise Lost, and particularly the characters such as Satan, Adam, and God, are going to be used as points of intertextual reference in both the outward description and the self-description of these characters. And we're going to be kind of producing quite a rich, nuanced, and complex tapestry of both how the text is used and how those figures in the Milton are imagined within Frankenstein. So Frankenstein itself is a very intertextual text, which makes a lot of reference to other books, either overtly or obliquely by mirroring language or quotations. So giving you some of the main ones here. These first two, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the Vicar of Wakefield, are both associated with Walton. Rime of the Ancient Mariner, of course, is about essentially a cursed man who does indeed defy the divine order by killing an albatross, and then has to pay for it with an eternal form of damnation. And think about that. That's something that we're going to be getting back to in the third section, but there's some interesting resonances there outside Walton's story. We obviously also have this engagement when Victor describes the creature for the first time. We have this reference to Dante's Inferno, and this motif of Dante's Inferno will recur in the novel as well a little bit. There's also direct quotation from Percy Shelley's poem Mutability, where Victor's in the mountains thinking about how changeable life is. And there's a portion taken as well from Tintern Abbey by William Wordsworth when we're exploring the aesthetics and particularly the sublime of the landscape. Now, the four most important texts are these. These are the texts that the creature has access to, finds, or hears read out, in the case of the Volney, when he is learning human speech and he's learning to read. So these are the books with which he has first contact, and how essentially he learns about the human world. So these are the texts that not only structure or enable him to understand the world, but they in fact structure or construct his understanding of the world generally, of human society, and also of himself. And that's something that we're going to be going back to. So they were quite interesting texts to choose. The Ruins of Empire was written around the time of the French Revolution, coming out of the French Revolution, and is a survey of the different empires and monarchies, different modes of rule across the world, which is quite condemning of all of those different monarchical or aristocratic ruling systems. So you've got a fairly anarchical text forming the background to the creature's conceptions of politics, perhaps, and potentially conceptions of power relationships. So this kind of foregrounding of the Ruins of Empire does suggest, to some extent, perhaps some subversive tendencies within the text and what it might be going to do with the Milton. The Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans has arguably a contrary effect, producing these classical models of prescribed masculinity. The Sorrows of Young Werther is essentially a romantic education, and if you haven't read Werther by Goethe, it's the story of a young man full of sensibility and emotions who kills himself because he can't have the love that he wants. But the really key text that becomes a motif all the way through Frankenstein is Paradise Lost by Milton, which is, as Milton explains, a theodicy, attempting to explain the ways of God to man. And it depicts the fall, the setting up of hell, the fall from heaven, sorry, the setting up of hell, and then the human fall as well, and the devil's interactions with humankind at that beginning period. And this is a text that is going to inform the creature's sense of the kind of theological construction of the world and how the world works in the kind of beyond the physical sense. So, particularly John Milton, his Paradise Lost is important as well because it forms the epigraph. But it's worth noting that there are, of course, two main editions of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. One published in 1818 and one in 1831. So the 1818 edition was published by Mary Shelley, but its preface was written by Percy Shelley, she accounts, and it also has the epigraph. And you'll notice in the 1831 version, where Mary Shelley writes her own preface, this epigraph has disappeared. And we'll talk later in the second section about what that change might suggest or signify. But it is quite interesting that it is one of the parts of the text that gets removed. Now, the full quotation or the full epigraph is, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me?" But that is, of course, taken from a larger passage from Paradise Lost. Now, the whole larger book of Paradise Lost is a lot more complex. And in a sense, this little snippet really kind of changes or elides some of the meaning that is there in the original text. So this is Adam complaining after being kicked out of the Garden of Eden. And he says, "Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mold me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me, or here place in this delicious garden? As my will concurred not to my being, it were but right and equal to reduce me to my dust. Desirous to resign and render back all I received, unable to perform thy terms too hard, by which I was to hold the good I sought not." So you have here, obviously, in this passage, Adam complaining about the severity of the punishment for his infraction. And it seems to be an indictment of God, or this particular conception of the divine. And you might think about how that appears, that meaning is foregrounded by the choice that is made for this epigraph. Of course, just in case you haven't read the Milton, the larger context of this is a few lines later. Adam starts to reconsider this logic and talks about the way, for example, that he was happy to accept the benefits and is only cavailing against the punishments, for example. And he starts to pick apart his own logic here. So this is the bit where we're going to go into breakout rooms quickly. So I'm just going to ask you in your breakout rooms, and again, if you don't want to participate, that's fine. I'll send you in there and you can lurk. That's totally cool. I want you just quickly to chat with each other. What's your experience with Frankenstein and reading Frankenstein, first of all? And then also, how do you understand this epigraph in regard to the text? What is this Miltonic quotation doing or suggesting about reading Frankenstein? Okay. So I'm resuming my recording. Please remember to have your microphones off, y'all. So what I'm going to be thinking about, particularly in this first section, is the way that Paradise Lost acts as a framing text from Frankenstein in a couple of different ways. The first of those ways is that it is a motif throughout the text, which is recurred to more or less overtly in various different ways. There are direct quotations, there are direct references, and there are more oblique echoings of the text itself and some of its underlying motifs. But I'm also looking at it as a framing text in terms of its relationship with the creature, or the creature's relationship with Paradise Lost. So Paradise Lost is one of those 4 books which he uses to understand the world, but he also uses it to construct his understanding of the world, or to construct the world, essentially. So he uses it as a kind of framing structure for how he builds up his understanding of his relationships with other people, his own place in the world, things such as the nature of evil. And it also is key to his process of understanding himself and his place and his self-creation as well. So he interacts with Paradise Lost, as I'm highlighting here, as a true history. So he's interacting with it as a source of theological authority. He's also using it directly in his own life. So he's referring to himself as he's reading it. So fitting himself within the overall narrative, but also applying the kind of the story as it goes and particular characters and their experiences to his own. So the two that he really points out as kind of being two characters through whom he understands himself or his place, or through whom he tries to understand himself and his place, are Adam and Satan. And he says at different points that he aligns with both Adam and Satan. So there are similarities that he has with both characters, but there is a difference between how these similarities are kind of imagined. So he says that, like Adam, I was apparently united by no link, to any other being in existence. So here, this is a sort of factual mirroring, in that he's saying that just like Adam, I was the firstborn or first created of a new type or species or person. Sorry, I feel like somebody's got their microphone on because I'm getting quite a bit of echo. Aha, got you. There we go, mute. So we have this sort of factual identification, but there is a comparison to be made when you see his identification with Satan. That's a much more personal identification, where he's recognizing his character and his experience and his choices, in a sense, or his rich internal emotional life as reminiscent of Satan. So there's already perhaps a pull towards that satanic self-identification, where he says that I viewed the bliss of my protectors and the bitter gall of envy rose within me. But he also starts to map out some of the differences between him and these two figures. So particularly, he's noting differences from Adam. So whereas Adam was perfect, happy, and prosperous, he is wretched, helpless, and alone. And he points as well to the fact repeatedly that he views himself as having been created as monstrous or deformed. So we obviously, when we're reading that today, read it as sort of ableist language and ableist ideas, but it's also a particular theological conception of himself as morally deformed in a way which is externalized in his appearance, and which essentially separates him from the Adamic role. So he is associated with, or he associates himself with Satan in the text in different ways. And I think it is important to draw that distinction. He associates himself in one way or in a particular set of ways, and he is associated with Satan by other characters in different ways. Now, some of these associations are as direct as we've just looked at, but some of them are much less overt. And one of the things that we find as a kind of continuing motif is the visual language, specifically of pandemonium. So if you've not read Milton's Paradise Lost, it depicts the casting down of the angels into hell. And once they emerge from the lake of fire, they go to the city or construct the city of pandemonium, which is where they reign in hell, essentially. But this imagery of hell and pandemonium is echoed in the visual register when we are introduced to the creature after the initial abandonment. So after the initial abandonment, we next meet him in the mountains. And Victor says, as I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. I could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. So there's a lot going on in there, but as you'll see, I've taken some excerpts from Milton and put them in different colors around it. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is directly mapping the exact language, but it is very clearly, I think, taking from this visual imaginary, both in terms of its depiction of the creature and how he appears essentially highlighted against the skyline, standing out, which is very reminiscent of Satan's own appearance, that he above the rest in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower. We also have the flashing lightning, which reminds us of the fall itself, which we have in red, of heaven received us falling, and the thunder winged with red lightning and impetuous rage. And we also have, in terms of this kind of frozen, inhospitable, harsh, mountainous landscape in this case, we have this echo of that deserted, inhuman and yet sublime space of hell and pandemonium. So as we see in the sort of orangey text there, or many are frozen, many are fiery. I say that and then I realize I'm colorblind when it comes to orange. So whatever that color is on the other side. Rocks, caves, lakes, fens, bogs, dens and shades of death. A universe of death, which God by curse created evil, for evil only good. Where all life dies, death lives, and nature breeds perverse, all monstrous, all prodigious things, abominable, unutterable, and worse. So you can see in this imagery of himself and his figuring of his own monstrosity and that connection with the landscape, you're seeing it, the Frankenstein narrative here mirroring the kind of visual and aesthetic techniques of the Milton. So this view of the creature comes from Frankenstein, or Victor Frankenstein himself. And he, by using this imagery, which is pulling from a kind of visual vocabulary of pandemonium, is casting the creature as a satanic or demonic figure in a fairly traditional and conservative sense, understood as evil, as an enemy of the good. But we're also seeing the creature himself interacting and using this imagery of pandemonium and flipping the narrative significantly. So when he has found the de Lacys and he enters, he's been run out from a town, he's been beaten, and he runs away and finds this hovel or this shelter. And it presented to me then as exquisite and divine, a retreat as pandemonium appeared to the demons of hell after their sufferings in the lake of fire. So here we're already getting a sort of swap in terms of our sympathy. So he is identifying with Satan, but he's also creating this narrative in which Satan is the sufferer, the victim, and the innocent, and in which pandemonium becomes a place that he longs to attain, becomes this kind of satanic home, which involves this alienation from the societal structures as they exist. And he will go on later in the novel, of course, to keep repeating that desire to exit, to escape, to enter a different space. So going back to these kind of more overt mentions of his identification with Satan, we see him here again talking to Frankenstein, saying, "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed." So as the novel continues, he comes increasingly to identify himself as a should have been Adam, but an actually satanic figure. So in this, he's interpreting his relationship with Frankenstein, and he's also casting Frankenstein in a particular kind of divine role, which is a fairly unjust God of wrath. But as I've said before, what we're finding with his use of Paradise Lost is he's not simply using it to understand the world, but he's using it to construct his own sort of sense of self and construct his universe, essentially. And so we start to find that this narrative of Paradise Lost becomes a narrative which informs how he explains himself in a sort of relationship where Paradise Lost is making him become something, because he's reading his narrative as being trapped within these guidelines, within these tracks, in a sense. So he starts to talk about himself and the inevitability, essentially, of his fall, that the fallen angel becomes a malignant devil. And that pattern has become naturalized through the text of Paradise Lost. We're also sort of seeing in his association of himself with Satan that he is casting Victor as creator, a role that Victor keeps refusing. We'll come back to that later, but he casts Victor as creator in a role which makes Victor worse than any tyrannical god that you could find in Milton, because at least that god made man beautiful and alluring after his own image. He gave him companions, but the creature says, I am but a filthy type of yours, more horrid even from the resemblance. As I've already said, we're also getting him using these narratives to understand and explain who he is. And we're getting some more problematic mirrorings of the Satanic narrative. So when we think of the imagination of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, there are two, as we'll see, there are two key strands of thought. And we have, either the traditional conception of the evil Satan and the good God, or the divine, and then the flipped idea of the rebel or the victim Satan and the cruel and tyrannical God. But it's worth noting that Milton's text itself and Frankenstein is much more ambiguous and nuanced than this. What we find in Milton's Paradise Lost is in those first two books, Satan has very much a form of sublimity, and he is within a sort of heroic, or at least a protagonist mold. But as Paradise Lost develops, we become more and more acquainted with the Satanic figure, and that sublimity to some extent sloughs off as it reveals underneath things like his malice, at times his cowardice, and certainly the baseness of some of his nature. So Milton's Paradise Lost recognizes and starts to peel away some of the rhetoric and some of the sophistry of the demonic. And we particularly see this in regard to his vengeance, that he is taking out on the innocent. But Satan says, thank him who puts me loath to this revenge, on you who wrong me not, for him who wronged. And should I at your harmless innocence melt as I do, yet public reason, just honor, and empire with revenge enlarged by conquering this new world compels me now to do what else, though damned, I should abhor. So spake the fiend, and with necessity the tyrant's plea excused his devilish deeds. So Satan is here saying this, I'm doing something that I know to be wrong, but I'm driven to it by my enemy, even though you are innocent. But that narratorial intervention there in those last two lines, so spake the fiend, and with necessity the tyrant's plea excused his devilish deeds. We have this narratorial commentary which undermines Satan's claims. So it's worth bearing in mind this Miltonic context when we're looking at the creature's claims about his revenge. Because he says, I will revenge my injuries. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my arch enemy, because my creator, do I swear inextinguishable hatred. Have a care, I will work at your destruction, nor finish until I desolate your heart, so that you shall curse the hour of your birth. But like Milton's Satan, this revenge is falling frequently on the innocent, on the young boy William, on Justine, on Clerval, and also arguably on his father, who dies of a broken heart. And we're having this mix, as we see in the Satanic Miltonic narrative, of revenge and remorse, where at the end, the creature, when he's talking to Walton, says, do you think that I was then dead to agony and remorse? He continued, pointing to the corpse, he suffered not in the consummation of the deed. Oh, not the 10,000th portion of the anguish that was mine during the lingering detail of its execution. So he's producing this narrative. I'm doing what I don't want to do. I've been driven to it. But although we don't have this revealed necessarily as sophistry in Frankenstein, it is because of this echoing, this very direct and very overt echoing of the Miltonic narrative, providing this potential sort of slightly skeptical commentary on the creature's own arguments. I should note that this was a fairly common argument in the 18th century, though, about that it's worse for the guilty. So that's also a bit of a time thing, but his sophistry is, I think, being critiqued by the text through the use of this Miltonic intertextuality. So we've talked about the creature identifying with Satan, and now it's worth mentioning Frankenstein himself. Now, Frankenstein usually casts himself as a form of Adam. He often refuses the role of creator or imagines himself and his responsibilities in terms of being a creator. But we're also starting to see him in the text, never very overtly, but to identify or align himself with Satan. And it's worth questioning which Satan, but in this particular instance, I would say with the fairly traditional conception of a monstrous satanic figure. So one of the ways in which he starts to align himself, maybe not consciously even in his own rhetoric, but the way in which his rhetoric starts to align him with Satan is in his discussions of everything being his fault and having unleashed death upon the world. So we see here, for example, after the creature has killed for the first time, it says, "Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch, whose delight was in carnage and misery, had he not murdered my brother." So you have this idea of him letting loose into the world, not just a killer, but death itself. And as you can probably tell from the illustration I'm using, there is an echoing here of the Miltonic narrative, because in Milton's imagination of hell and heaven and this kind of eternal conflict, and it's worth noticing here that he was adding a lot to what there's hardly anything in the Bible about any of this. So he's adding from church tradition, he's adding from extra apocryphal writings, but he's also producing some of this imaginary himself. And one of the things that we have is this idea that when Satan leaves hell, he meets at the gate his progeny. And you can see them here. He meets sin in the middle, and he meets death, who he has by his actions unleashed upon the world, as has Frankenstein. We also start to see other characters align him with the satanic figure, although again, it's never quite as overt as it is with the creature. This is something that Walton says, and Walton is very much in an act of hero worship throughout much of the text. He starts off by discussing Frankenstein as the divine wanderer. And he certainly retains a lot of that awe and reverence, but we can see this kind of satanic reading slipping into his language, where he talks about Frankenstein's kind of physical and also moral and mental appearance, that what a glorious creature must he have been in the days of his prosperity, when he is thus noble and godlike in ruin. He seems to feel his own worth and the greatness of his fall. So here we have an echo of the particular Miltonic language of the archangel ruined, which is the description of Satan in the same passages where we see him proud and eminent. But this idea of godlike in ruin is echoing that visual imagery of the satanic, and this greatness of his fall and this sense of a loss of worth to the fall maps much more closely onto the satanic fall than it does to the Adamic fall. The Adamic fall is not a fall of pride in the same way. It's a fall into sin, and it's a sin that is rooted in pride, but it's not that he was challenging the divine and is then aware of his worth and his loss of basically sort of the highest positions in heaven. So the main sort of comparison, though, with Satan that we find in regards to Frankenstein is a motif that is used, and it becomes a motif in the narrative, a particular phrase or sort of a series of reworkings of a particular phrase. And it is used for both the creature and Frankenstein himself, but much more with Frankenstein. It's taken from this passage from Paradise Lost, where Satan is discussing his state, his fall, that horror and doubt distract his troubled thoughts, and from the bottom stir the hell within him. For within him hell he brings, and round about him, nor from hell one step, no more than from himself can fly by change of place. Now conscious wakes despair that slumbered, wakes the bitter memory of what he was, what is, and what must be worse, of worse deeds, worse sufferings that must ensue. So this idea of carrying hell around with you comes from the satanic narrative. It's a satanic recognition of the fall, but it's also associated with a number of things such as guilt pride, sorrow. And we'll find that it's echoing in the descriptions of Frankenstein and the creature serve different functions in relation to each one, which produce kind of different satanic narratives in relation to both of them. So Frankenstein says that I bore a hell within me, which nothing could extinguish after the death of Justine. So this is a hell within his heart, caused or produced by the guilt that is springing from his the fact that he's guilty, essentially, of not trying to stop this death. It's his creation which has led to both the death of his brother and Justine, who's been punished for it. He also, when he is pursuing the creature in the last part of the novel, says, I was cursed by some devil and carried about with me my eternal hell. So here we are again getting with Frankenstein something that we're going to keep seeing is the abdication of responsibility, where the hell that he carries around with him, he's not recognizing it as the product of his own guilt or of his own misdemeanors, but rather he is suggesting that it was given to him. But what is also particularly interesting about this passage is that he essentially casts himself in the satanic role and the creature in an angelic or divine role, because he then says, yet still a spirit of good followed and directed my steps, and when I most murmured would suddenly extricate me from seemingly insurmountable difficulties. We later learn, of course, that the creature is essentially aiding him in his pursuit of the creature, giving him food, for example. The third example is much more linked to this idea of satanic pride. And here he is creating this idea, this very common idea in the Romantic period of the satanic overreacher. Again, failing to blame himself, but all my speculations and hopes are as nothing, and like the archangel who aspired to omnipotence, I am chained in an eternal hell. So he recognizes himself there in this satanic narrative of pride. The creature also uses this phrase that I bore a hell within me, but it's a different linguistic construction here because he is not using any metaphor, but rather in his reference to Satan, at least, is using a simile. So I like the archfiend. So instead of having this deep personal connection and echoing with the satanic, particularly the sort of conservatively understood satanic here, there is a slight distancing, and this hell that he bears with him is being considered and reproduced as an emotional state rather than, as it is with Frankenstein, a moral state. So we've talked about the satanic references and overlapping there. And we can also, of course, talk about the way in which both the creature and Frankenstein picture themselves as the Adam of the Miltonic narrative. Now, the creature says, of course, I am thy creature. I will be even docile, mild and docile to my natural lord and king. So again, I'm just wanting to take us back to this idea that he is constructing his world out of Paradise Lost in potentially problematic ways in his imagination of himself as Adam. Because as we can see here, what he's using Paradise Lost to do is to construct his understanding of power relationships within that world. And he is reinscribing the essentially aristocratic, patriarchal, and particular theological structures in which he cannot survive through his kind of application of this map of power relations that Paradise Lost suggests. We're also finding in these passages where he's identifying with Adam a peculiar phenomenon. So see if you can pick it up here. But he, Adam, had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. So here we're obviously getting that comparison with Adam where he loses out, but we're also getting a self-definition which has nothing of the self in it. It's a self-definition which is completely predicated on his relationship with his creator. Even those adjectives at the end, wretched, helpless, and alone, all refer to his interrelation with his creator rather than any internal property that he has. So Paradise Lost is informing the ways in which he is capable of understanding himself and the way in which he relates to the world. It also models his wants for him. As we find later, he, of course, asks for a companion. And as for this being you must create, he wants, as Adam was offered, he wants a female, specifically companion. But this is a want which you could debate whether it's coming from his own particular needs and desires, or whether it is being created by the desires that he sees represented before him. Now, I think what's interesting is that he is engaged in quite a destructive relationship with the conception of Adam there, both to the kind of his self-worth and his possibilities of reimagining a different life for himself or different power relations. But there is a sort of sense within the narrative, not when he is speaking about himself directly or speaking about these paradise lost paradigms, but when he is describing his life, and particularly his early days, he produces an Adamic narrative here as well, but it's one which he's not trying to produce. He is not telling you, I am Adam, but instead he's showing how his own situation is mirroring essentially the prelapsarian state of Adam, as he is, he's spending his time in the woods, and there's this echoing almost of language with several changes of day and night passed, and the orb of night had greatly lessened. This idea of the clear stream and the beautiful kind of harmony of the animals and the bird song. And essentially what goes wrong in his Adamic journey is his connection with the human. So that is partly when he enters the human world and moves away from this Edenic space, but it's also when he takes a human as his creator, because literally, of course, Frankenstein has created him out of body pieces. But by placing Victor Frankenstein in the role of the divine in his own life, he evacuates the possibility of having his own Adamic narrative, making himself essentially, or becoming trapped essentially in a narrative of opposition, which turns him into a satanic figure, or into sort of this satanic divine competition narrative. Now, Adam also sees himself as Frankenstein also sees himself as a form of Adam. As I've said before, he really struggles or fights against engaging with the idea of himself as a creator. And we have here this fairly traditional representation or mirroring of Adam, but it's very different from what the creature is doing. Here, Frankenstein is associating himself with this idea of Adam the overreacher, the almost Faustian character, who defies the orders of God to take both from the tree of life and from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we have this idea of the irrevocability of the act, but we have this idea of him being that overreacher, which essentially aligns his conception of Adam much more with a satanic conception of Adam as the overreacher, particularly within the romantic imagination. Now, just as I'm coming to the end of this section, it's worth noting that there's also another bit of echoing that the creature has in terms of a passage that is echoed from the Milton. And that is Eve's viewing of her own reflection in Paradise Lost. You can see from the picture there that Milton is also borrowing from Narcissus in the myth of Narcissus, the man who sees himself and falls in love so he can't get away from himself. He just looks at himself for the rest of ever. And you can see at the top there, you have the section from Paradise Lost, and we have Eve looking at herself, finding much to love in her reflection. And she says, there I had fixed mine eyes till now, and pined with vain desire, had not a voice less warned me what there thou seest, fair creature, is thyself. So we have this sort of reflection in a pool moment, which is then echoed in this sort of dark version in Frankenstein, and with the creature viewing himself for the first time reflected as in a mirror. And I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am. I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. So the monster, unlike Eve, never has a chance to see himself as anything but a deformed version of what is possible. And so we're also getting a comparison of Eve's here, but essentially also a comparison of creators, with the creator of Frankenstein never being able to measure up to the creator of Eve. So I just sort of point this out as these are producing some potentially subversive readings of Milton's Paradise Lost, but they're also producing some slightly more conservative readings of Paradise Lost, as we can see here, perhaps, where in this echoing of Eve, it makes Frankenstein into a terrible creator while valorizing the alternative Miltonic deity. Now, let's get on to this idea of God and the creator that is being reflected in this text and the theological work that is potentially going on in relation to this creator figure. Now, Frank is, of course, the creator, and this role is reiterated again and again and again within the text. But there's also an interesting juxtaposition here that he's called the cursed creator. So he is essentially here both cursed, both Adamic, both human, and divine in terms at least of those structures of power relationships and his relation to the creature of who he has created. As I've said before as well, Frank is very reluctant to take upon himself this creatorial identity. And we have really late in the novel him saying, for the first time, I felt what the duties of a creator were towards his creature, and that I ought to render him happy before I complained of his wickedness. Just, he realizes that a couple of years too late, basically. But this idea of Frankenstein as a sort of terrible creator, what is that doing in theological terms? Do we have in Frankenstein a terrible replacement of the divine who can never match up? So who doesn't give his Adam and Eve, who doesn't answer his Adam's pleas, who abandons his Adam for no reason? Or is there a more theologically subversive narrative going on here where we have the possibility that what we are getting recorded is an accurate copy of the divine? So one of the passages that I've drawn out here is this interesting echoing of the biblical language of the unchangeable nature of God, where Victor says, when the creature is begging him to change his mind, says, "Leave me, I am inexorable." But this idea of a fixed, wrathful, and potentially unjust God is arguably, or could be read as well as a theological critique occurring within the narrative. But I don't think you should read it either one way or the other. I don't think that going for a simplistic reading in either direction really does justice to the way in which these depictions are so ambiguous and engage so richly with these Miltonic models. Now, the last thing for this section is going back and thinking about Walton. I said that all three of these characters reflect characters from Milton's Paradise Lost. And we do find that with Walton as well. He becomes a sort of form of Frankenstein and a form of the creature. He too is an overreacher, too is an Adamic or potentially quasi-satanic figure in the sense of satanic overreaching. But he, unlike Frankenstein and his creature, is on a cusp of decision. He has his choice to make, to be an Adam or to be a Satan, essentially, you could argue. But we see him drawn towards this satanic narrative which Frankenstein has followed. We see a reimagining for him of pandemonium, a pandemonium that calls to him as it had called to the creature. But his pandemonium visually reflects the sort of desolation of pandemonium as it exists in the Miltonic narrative, but also in this emphasis on frost and ice, echoes the Dante's Inferno of the deepest, the most internal region of hell. And he is drawn towards his pandemonium, but he has the opportunity to turn back, something that he does do. And he has this moment where he recognizes and then re-envisions his satanic self, as it were. He recognizes the folly, the risk, the danger, the selfishness, the egotism of what he's doing. Says it is terrible to reflect that the lives of all these men are endangered through me. If we are lost, my mad schemes are the cause. So he has a moment of clarity here. He then goes back to trying to exhort the men to continue, or wanting them to continue, egged on by Frankenstein. But it's a notable difference from Frankenstein himself, who is never able to fully reimagine his own place and his own role and confront his own culpability. And so in being unable to do so, he becomes increasingly satanic, whereas Walton moves back into the realm of the Adamic, arguably. So I've been waiting for you and your questions. What you got? So going in, so in this section, I'm thinking about what narratives of Satan are being produced, and then therefore what kind of narratives of theology and the divine are being produced within this text through these intertextual references to Milton. So my title for this slide that I came up with at about 5 a.m. yesterday / this morning is Too Many Satans Spoil the Broth. I don't know what the broth is, but too many Satans. So basically, the idea that I'm wanting to kind of convey here is the way in which there are multiple different imaginations of Satan, particularly stemming from this 18th century period, and of course the romantic rereading of the Satanic figure, much of which is filtered through Milton's Paradise Lost. So you have the more traditional sort of conceptions of the demonic within a divine universe, and it is an opposing force. And that's very broad strokes, and there's a lot of different theologies that you can go with, but let's just broad stroke it here. This idea of the devil as the enemy and opposition, and also as the liar and tempter, as we see here. Then as we're moving into this kind of romantic reimagining, which I'm just about to talk about, we get this both sort of aesthetic and narratorial change regarding how Satan is depicted and understood, and focusing on him as sort of the fallen opponent of a tyrannical god. And as we're moving into the 20th and 21st century, as my other pictures here, we have a Satan in the popular imagination, which is often a symbol of resistance, often quite progressive politics, or just being really sexy in an 80s movie, whichever. But what is going on? Which Satans do we have in Frankenstein, essentially? Well, from Frankenstein's own point of view, he views the creature as a Satan or as a demon, a devil in the traditional sense. This is just one of the many instances where he calls him devil. I exclaim, "Do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, and I may trample you to dust. And oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." Had to get an extra diabolical in there, I guess. So here is this quite traditional image of the Satanic figure as a murderer in enmity with God, or with the sort of proponent of the divine. There's this worm-like imagery, so pointing towards the degradation of the Satanic figure. And we also have him appearing to some extent as a tempter. Now, this is the idea of the creature as Satanic that Frankenstein produces, but is that what we're finding in the narrative more broadly? Is that what we're finding in the creature's self-representation? Well, we need to have a look at this changing narrative of the Satanic that comes out of the rereading of Milton in this period. Now, I talked about this a lot in my previous talk, and we talked about Milton's sublime and narratives of the sublime as they developed in the 18th century. I'm happy to answer questions about this, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I did a whole lecture on it. So I'm happy to pop the link in or answer any questions. But what we're getting in the 18th century is this rise of the discourse of the sublime, and Milton's Satan being used as a paradigmatic example of this valorized aesthetic. Now, we can talk about how the demonic interacts with the sublime. Again, it's in that video, but there's still a fairly theological conservative reading to be had, which we'll often find in the Gothic, which is that the sublimity of this Satan is perverse and partial, a broken reflection of the divine. It's a form of terror sublimity without any other of the accoutrements of sublimity. But what this sort of connection of the Satanic figure in Milton with this discourse of the sublime opens the pathway for is this romantic rereading of Satan that we find most famously expressed, of course, in William Blake, who says the reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. So there's a suggestion here that there's basically a flip going on, that God is being cast in the role of evil tyrant, and Satan, upon whose side Milton is being cast as the hero or anti-hero. Now, you can debate what you think about this, and I don't agree with Blake, but this is certainly the imaginarium of, I just made that up, right? The imaginary of Satan that is appearing in this period and this changing discourse. And this is a discourse with which Mary Shelley would have been very familiar. And I'm going to use a couple of examples from people who were in her milieu, in fact, in her family, who are articulating this rereading of Satan. Now, there's two different rereadings, and they are slightly different. And I'm going to suggest that Frankenstein is really interacting with one of them more strongly than the other. Now, William Godwin was Mary Shelley's father, and in his inquiry concerning political justice, he moves on to reassess this satanic figure within the context of the moral sublime, which again, I talked about in that Sublime lecture. So he's noting that Milton's devil has been considered of considerable virtue, which in itself is interesting. He has a moral sublimity rooted in actual virtues. It must be admitted that his energy is centered too much in personal regards. So we are getting this critique of the satanic figure as well. But why did he rebel against his maker? It was, as he himself informs us, because he saw no sufficient reason for that extreme inequality of rank and power, which the creator assumed. So we're seeing here the satanic figure as a rebel against unequal and unfair power structures. He's also there, if you kind of read along and keep going, he's rebelling against the lack of reason in the kind of organization of the universe and of its power structures. He's cherishing opposition because he believes that he was injuriously treated. He is not discouraged by an unequal context when it is in the name of what is right, when reason and justice was stronger in his mind than a sense of brute force. And we're also being pointed towards his feelings of being of an Epictetus or a Cato, and not of a slave in this context, sort of presumably referring to these ideas of kind of grand and noble emotional register, that he refuses to be bowed by despotic power. So we have this very positive rereading of the satanic figure, and one which has become very common and very popular, of course, today. Now, what we are finding in Mary Shelley is perhaps borrowing from some of these ideas, but we don't really have in the creature somebody who is rebelling openly and committing a revolt, an armed revolt or an overthrow of this system. As I've already talked about in the first section, because of the ways in which I believe, because of the ways in which he's read Paradise Lost and his other informing or world constructing texts, he's actually engaged in the propagation of that world which ejects him. But we are seeing some of these satanic qualities. But I think more closely, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein's creature echoes the conception of the Miltonic Satan, which appears in Percy Bysshe's Defense of Poetry, or Percy Shelley's. So Milton's poem, he argues, contains within itself a philosophical refutation of that system of which, by a strange and natural antithesis, it has been a chief popular support. So he is arguing here that Milton's poem, which is a theodicy, which has been used to defend religion, essentially is an attack upon it, or functions as an attack upon it. So nothing can exceed the energy and magnificence of the character of Satan as expressed in Paradise Lost. It is a mistake to suppose that he could ever have been intended for the popular personification of evil. Implacable hate, patient cunning, and a sleepless refinement of device to evil, and although venial in a slave, are not to be forgiven in a tyrant. Although redeemed by much that ennobles his defeat in one subdued, are marked by all that dishonors his conquest in the victor. But Milton's devil as a moral being is as far superior to his God as one who perseveres in some purpose which he has conceived to be excellent in spite of adversity and torture, is to one who in the cold security of undoubted triumph inflicts the most horrible revenge upon his enemy. not from any mistaken notion of inducing him to repent of a perseverance in enmity, but with the alleged design of exasperating him to deserve new torments. Milton has so far violated the popular creed as to have alleged no superiority of moral virtue to his God over his devil. So here we're having this idea that neither God nor Satan are entirely justified in their actions and methods, but that the satanic figure has a much greater degree of moral sublimity because he is resisting this overwhelming force, and his resistance is far nobler than the cold tyranny of the divine figure, who persecutes his enemy not to attempt a rapprochement or to attempt a reformation, but rather just in the interests of torture and of destruction. I think if we start to apply this or try and find this within the Frankenstein narrative, this is very clearly, I think, what we're seeing in the relationship between Frankenstein and the creature, who come increasingly to echo each other, erasing some of those divisions between them, that binary that Frankenstein tries to set up of you are other, different, you are the satanic figure, and I am the man, the image of the divine. So erasing some of those boundaries, but also erasing some of those theological boundaries between the divine and the demonic, in ways which can lead to quite subversive readings of the Miltonic content in the novel. So what we find in this relationship between Frankenstein and his creature is, of course, this sort of satanic self-reflection. So Frankenstein is very engaged in this binarization of their identities, this idea that they are not the same at all, saying there can be no community between you and me. We are enemies, begone. But of course, that is not quite so true, and their identities start to merge or bleed together at different points. Now, one of these ways is the way in which Victor constantly associates himself with the crimes of the creature, calling himself the murderer of his friends, for example. But it also manifests in the way that he blames the creature for everything, as we find in this particular example where he went to sea in the middle of the North Sea, I think, and just went to sleep in his little boat and got lost in a storm, as you do. Just as an FYI, if any of you have not read that much Mary Shelley, this idea of getting lost in a boat at a pivotal moment is really quite key in Mary Shelley. But as he's there in his boat, completely his own fault, he says, "Fiend, your task is already fulfilled. I thought of Elizabeth, of my father, and of Clerval, all left behind, on whom the monster might satisfy his sanguinary and merciless passions." So certainly there's this idea of kind of this bleed of their identities. There's also a really interesting dynamic going on with what's happening to the power relationship between them, and how that very much confuses the divine satanic hierarchy that you have, even in Paradise Lost, even in romantic rereadings of Paradise Lost, where the devil is basically hopelessly outmanned and outgunned. But in this particular section, the creature says, "You are my creator, but I am your master, obey." So in the narrative of Adam, Satan, and God, creator and master are synonymous terms, but they become separated in this relationship between Frankenstein and his creature, as Frankenstein is evidently the creator, but eventually the creature shucks off those power relationships of obedience and notes himself, because of his physical prowess at least, to be the master of Frankenstein. Now, very quickly, just to end this section, it's also worth talking about the way in which many critics have engaged with this text as a particularly sort of feminist or proto-feminist, rather than simply romanticist, reimagining of the Satanic. Adriana Creation, in a really good article that you can get for free online, Romantic Satanism and the Rise of 19th Century Women's Poetry, has said that scholars have largely neglected women's writings on Satan, but Romantic women writers found a surprising range of poetic uses for Milton's Satan, the most significant being a vision of outcast female genius, a feminist romantic Satanism. Now, I think there's an argument to be had about whether we can simply view all of these male characters as female ciphers or female avatars, when there are female characters who are fulfilling their own roles within the narrative. But certainly, I think this idea of the way in which the rewriting of the potentially satanic figure that we have in the creature becomes, in his quest for a claim to sublime subjectivity, as we talked about again in the Sublime lecture I did, echoes that search for women to claim their own sublime subjectivity rather than that beautiful objectivity that we talked about, where they are recognized as producers of the sublime, as people in their own right. And Gilbert and Gabbard note that in the text, both Victor and the creature become a form of Eve. Victor through the act of childbearing, in this sense, they argue, and therefore the creator of the new race of not man. But also that the creature himself, as we've already noticed, becomes a form of sort of monstrous Eve, which underlines a sort of critical theological reading. It is Eve, after all, who languishes helpless and alone while Adam converses with superior beings, and it's Eve in whom the satanically bitter gall of envy rises, causing her to eat the apple in the hope of adding what wants in female sex. It is Eve, moreover, to whom deathly isolation is threatened, should Adam reject her, an isolation more terrible even than Satan's alienation from heaven. And finally, it is Eve whose body, like her mind, is said by Milton to resemble less his image who made both, and less to express the character of that dominion given over other creatures. In fact, to a sexually anxious reader, Eve's body might, like sin, seem horrid even from its very resemblance to her husband's, a filthy or obscene version of the human form divine. So here we have this reimagining of the creature as a sort of Eve figure. One who, when they look at themselves and their reflection, sees that this horrible visage, which becomes a sort of an encoded version of the female experience within the patriarchal world of the sort of religious narrative of the Milton's original text. So there are various different ways that we can read these depictions of Satan, and we might choose to read a more progressive way, but it's also worth remembering the way in which Frankenstein, there we go, is increasingly depicted as satanic as well, and which leans towards a slightly more conservative reading, because that Satanism is a form of evil. We also have the ways in which Frankenstein, the question that I asked at the end of the last section, which is Frankenstein as creator, does he become a sort of an example that points to how much better God is, or does he become a copy of the divine? And I think that we can ask ourselves these questions with never coming up quite with an answer, but an interesting point of inquiry is the difference between the two editions, the 1818 and the 1831. The 1818 includes the epigraph, and the preface was written by Percy Shelley. And we do have a greater emphasis on theological critique and subversion, with Shelley noting that however impossible as a physical fact, the actions of Frankenstein or Paradise Lost, they afford a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. So this is a defense of the spectacular, and it's a defense of the speculative, but it's also pointing towards the deeper theological and philosophical ramifications of the novel. Now, in the 1831 version, where there are a number of differences, most of which point to a slightly more conservative reading. For example, most of the references to Victor's free will become elided in the text, and there's an increasing emphasis on the way in which he is a victim of overwhelming fate. So that difference, like the lack of the epigraph, paints a potentially more positive or more conservative religious picture. If Victor is not to blame, if he is pulled on by an irresistible fate, it becomes less clearly a critique of any particular theological rendering of the divine. And it's also worth noting from Mary Shelley's preface that there's a much more conservative, theologically conservative moral being put forward, that frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. So here is being put forward very clearly the reading that Frankenstein is a lesser deformed version of God who has challenged him and failed. This is the failure of male pride and overreaching. And I think you could have extra many debates about why that change has occurred between 1818 and 1831. But that's my general reading of it there. A little bit more of an emphasis, at least, on a progressive or subversive reading of a sort of a positive rendering of Satan in the 1818 and less so in the 1831. So almost at the end. We're going to be looking at the idea of mortal immortality and how that is one of the sort of ways of approaching this depiction of the creature in Frankenstein. So mortal immortality, I'm really drawing from the name of one of Mary Shelley's stories here, The Mortal Immortal, but I'm using mortal immortality as a kind of shorthand for a particular construction of a particular Christian construction of the relationship between body and soul, between flesh and spirit, and conceptions of life and death. So this is incredibly broad and sweeping, and I'm not getting in any of the nuance in the different theologies here, but what you're looking at within Christian theology is a division between flesh and spirit and between soul and body. Now, soul and spirit and flesh and body are not synonymous terms. I'm not slipping into some kind of Manichaean dualism here. It's not to say body bad, spirit good, soul good, but there is a conception of a division that we are composed of both body and soul. And there is also a conception of a division between our flesh or our old self, the part of us that is indelibly corrupted by that original sin and inherited through the Adamic line. And the spirit, the part of us that can be fully cleansed and ascend after death. So the way in which those things interact with each other means that humans are essentially mortal immortals. There is an immortal part of us which will survive either for damnation or salvation. Arguably, depending on your theology there, that's a little bit more up for debate. But that immortality is in a sense, weirdly and paradoxically dependent on the mortality of our bodies. So our bodies die for our souls to be fully free. And our bodies are essentially mortal, but our souls are essentially immortal. So you have this juxtaposition at the very nature of what it is to be human. And the Gothic is quite often involved with depictions of some form of mortal immortality. So the Ghost, for example, is a depiction of the inevitability of mortal death, but also it was a depiction of immortality, of the immortality and immateriality of the soul. Now, when we're coming to Frankenstein and we're coming to a number of other Mary Shelley texts, what we're engaging with instead of the ghost and the disembodied immortality is a sense of an embodied immortality, and specifically an embodied damnation. Because within this theological framework, the inability to die, the inability to separate body and soul becomes a form of unending sort of purgatorial state, an unending damnation or condemnation within the body, because the body can't die, and therefore you can't die, and therefore you can't truly live. And Mary Shelley, in a number of her work, explores this idea of embodiment, unnaturally prolonged life, and mortal immortality. And I've used a couple of the stories here. Now, not all of these have immortality in them, but they have unnaturally extended life or surviving the entire rest of your species. So Valerius, the reanimated Roman, if you haven't read it, it's super weird, but quite fun. Is a story about a random Roman guy, and you don't know why, but he has been reanimated in the present day, and he's spending his time in Italy. The Last Man doesn't have an immortal, of course, but it does have the last man to survive in the entire world. So the sole survivor. And so his continued embodied life becomes a form of sort of purgatorial state, a form of damnation. The Mortal Immortal from 1833, which is the story of a man who sort of accidentally drank the elixir vitae and becomes a mortal immortal. And then Roger Dodsworth, The Reanimated Englishman, which was originally, I think, passed off as real, but tells about a man who has basically been frozen in an avalanche and is then resurrected a century later and is like, how's Cromwell doing? And they're like, oh, no. Yeah, we have a king again now. So it's they're fun little stories, but they do kind of demonstrate Mary Shelley's engagement with this figure or this idea of mortal immortality beyond Frankenstein itself. And it's applicable in Frankenstein because we have this creature who has clearly been reanimated, just as Valerius and Roger Dodsworth were. But perhaps more importantly, we have this idea of a physical frame which is seemingly in its reanimated state immune to a great deal of sort of the world. So it is immune to different weather. It is potentially immune to corruption. And the idea that the creature has is that the only way to destroy himself is to burn himself essentially on a pyre in the middle of the Arctic. And it's an ending which really interestingly echoes the ending of The Mortal Immortal. Now, I'm going to quickly look at these ideas of embodiment, damned embodiment in Mary Shelley more generally and in Frankenstein particularly through looking at 4 archetypes. And I don't mean archetype in the Jungian sense here. I mean very specifically these 4 archetypal characters upon which Frankenstein actually draws in its creation of its creature. And somebody mentioned at the beginning this idea of sort of damnation and being damned or punished. And that's definitely sort of the underlying narrative of these embodied immortalities. And it's something that we're getting through this narrative of the creature. So the first archetype that I'm looking at is the Rosicrucian hero, or in other words, the person who discovers the elixir vitae and drinks it. Now, Frankenstein, we find in the novel, is in his youth obsessed with discovering the elixir vitae and the philosopher's stone. Wealth was an inferior object, he tells us, but what glory would attend the discovery if I could banish disease from the human frame and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death. So he has this dream perhaps of glory rather than use, which centers on the idea of the artificial prolongation of life. And that is essentially what he attains with his chemical and natural philosophical, I'm not quite sure how you arrange those, experiments. But this idea of the Rosicrucian hero and the drinker of the elixir vitae within the literature of the period, and particularly within the Gothic always leads to tragedy. And we find that in the novel Godwin by St. Leon. Now, if you'd read St. Leon's socio-political work, including the Inquiry into Political Justice and the appended On Health in the 2nd edition, you would have found seemingly a more positive outlook on the possibility of the immortality of man, or at least a significant prolongation of life. We have this little excerpt at the top there, which is effectively summarizing the main points. That the term of human life may be prolonged, and that by immediate operation of intellect beyond any limits which we are able to assign. It would be ideal to talk of the absolute immortality of man. So in his Inquiry into Political Justice, William Godwin doesn't necessarily suggest that we could be completely immortal, but that we could work towards immortality. However, his vision is social. This is a social progression and a community progression towards ever increasingly prolonged life, eventually reaching something akin to immortality. And in his novel, Godwin, in St. Leon, he pictures a Rosicrucian hero who has attained eternal life, but has essentially broken his communal bonds. So he hasn't engaged in this move towards prolonged human life through the proper channels, as it were, through this idea of community improvement, but rather has snatched the gift, an unnatural one. And he says of himself, how unhappy the wretch, the monster rather, let me say, who is without an equal, who looks through the world and in the world cannot find a brother, who is endowed with attributes which no living being participates with him, and who is therefore cut off from every form of cordiality and confidence, can never unbend himself, but lives the solitary, joyless tenant of a prison, the material of which are emeralds and rubies. how unhappy this wretch, how weak and ignoble the man that voluntarily accepts these laws of existence. Now, particularly the first part, I think you can very clearly see the overlap with the Frankenstein narrative here. And this is a sort of reflection of this idea of embodied damnation. It's worth noting, of course, that Godwin was an atheological or an anti-theological writer in most of his work. And what we're actually finding in St. Leon is St. Leon trapping himself within a narrative of embodied damnation, which he can't move beyond to move towards other possibilities. But essentially, because he believes in it, we're seeing a narrative of embodied damnation. And again, we see that to some extent occurring in Frankenstein. But Mary Shelley also engages more directly with this idea of the Rosicrucian hero herself. I'm just going to pick up on a quick line at the bottom there from the St. Leon, where he says that we can ignoble the man that voluntarily accepts these laws of existence. So St. Leon, of course, has voluntarily accepted them. But in Mary Shelley's work, people rarely accept the immortality with which they are gifted and or punished. So Windsor in The Mortal Immortal, and yes, that is his name, repeats very much the language of St. Leon. They're not my fellows, the inextinguishable power of life in my frame and their ephemeral existence placed as wide as the poles asunder. I could not raise a hand against the meanest or the most powerful among them. Thus have I lived on for many a year alone and weary of myself, desirous of death, yet never dying, a mortal, immortal. So Windsor, as you can see, is decrying this eternal life, but very much decrying it as an unwanted gift. As I said, he sort of took the elixir by mistake. He thought it was a potion to get rid of love, and in a fit of sort of romantic jealousy, drinks it, but it gets rid of love by making him immortal, essentially. So taking him out of communion with his fellow man, but more importantly, in his case, outliving the object of his affection. And what we find in The Mortal Immortal is this narrative of embodied damnation and this search for an end, which echoes very, very closely what we find in Frankenstein itself. We find Windsor saying, I conceived a design by which I may end all without self-slaughter, without making another man a Cain or a murderer. An expedition which mortal frame can never survive. So where's he off to? Off to the North Pole. So this sort of North Pole acts as a pandemonium for the characters in Frankenstein, as an appealing pandemonium. But it also acts here as, sorry, that was my fire alarm going off. It is echoed here, that narrative is echoed here with Windsor going into the North Pole to destroy himself, to get rid of this embodied immortality in the way that the creature essentially proposes to do, because he says that he will die whether he succeeds or not, and I shall adopt more resolute means, and by scattering and annihilating the atoms that compose my frame, set at liberty the life imprisoned within, and so cruelly prevented from soaring from this dim earth to a sphere more congenial to its immortal essence. So you have written here in very big, bold letters that distinction between body and soul, and the idea of the necessity of death for soul freedom. And we can see it here in this narrative, which mirrors very closely what happens at the end of Frankenstein. And I think we can certainly read them as companion texts. It does, though, then go on to raise the question about Frankenstein's creature and his soul. So Frankenstein himself denies the possibility of a soul, essentially saying, looking at this monstrous image, which I had endued with the mockery of a soul still more monstrous. The creature, in turn, refers to his own spirit or soul. And there is a divided question here about whether the being created entirely by man, with no method himself to introduce a soul, can be said to have one. And then you're entering into the realm of questions about the reality of the soul, whether you need the conception of an immortal immaterial soul, or whether you can function within a purely materialist conception. And here we're getting into the writings of people like William Godwin and his theories of necessity, and Joseph Priestley. If the creature is fully flesh, is fully material, then he becomes ruled by the laws of necessity, that everything that happens has a reaction, and that works in the realm of the body and the mind as well, because the mind and body are material. This is the kind of basic materialism that you're getting in Priestley or Godwin, for example. And so it questions the very possibility of guilt, but points towards a really determinative narrative. Whereas if he has a soul, where did the soul come from? And does that mean that there is a divine presence within the novel, which is acting through Frankenstein, essentially, even though Frankenstein is arguably in rebellion? And if so, where do we stand on the question of free will? Where do we stand with the question of determinism and what happens with the creature? If we see that he has a soul and we know that Frankenstein didn't give it to him, does that reflect more negatively on the divine? Because then the divine becomes kind of ipso facto the same as, in terms of how he acts, he becomes the same as Frankenstein. So many questions asked connected with this one idea of whether he has a soul or not. Now, the next tradition that I will quickly talk about, and which we might find echoed, is, that wasn't right, actually. I can't find my mouse, but okay, here we go. The second one is, in fact, the second Adam. This idea of Adam. Obviously, Adam introduced death into the world, so he's not an archetype of immortality, but he is this model of somebody who is reaching out for both eternal life and knowledge at the same time with the tree. And so becomes this kind of emblem of somebody like the seeker after the elixir vitae. But the notable thing here that I sort of mentioned in relation to the elixir vitae and with the second Adam is that with Frankenstein's creature, this choice has never been his own to make. This immortality was thrust upon him. And therefore, if it's understood as a sort of punishment or an embodied damnation, what is the punishment for, and how does that reflect on our conception of the divine? So moving on to this idea of punishment and potentially divine injustice, we have this next intertext of the Wandering Jew. Now, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the Wandering Jew, but I'll just very quickly recap some of the basics for you. Now, this is a very early story after the death of Christ, coming from two main traditions, neither of which were originally focused on a Jewish character specifically. The Malchus tradition conflated the centurion who cut off Peter's ear with the carpenter, I think, and the Cartaphilus tradition was a doorman to Pontius Pilate, who the basic story is that as Jesus was walking up to the Golgotha with his cross on his back, they insulted him or refused to help him. And so he immediately turned around and cursed them with an eternal life of wandering, a dark mirror of his own wandering in life, but also a form of punishment, an embodied damnation, an unending punishment. Now, we're seeing this moving into a register which is very focused on a Jewish identity for this individual. And particularly, we're seeing it move into an incredibly anti-Semitic register in the 1600s at the latest, with the publication of one of the first surviving pamphlets, which is, as you can see, in German, one presumes. I just copied the name because I do not speak the German. But we have this narrative becoming kind of entwined with narratives of Jewish identity in ways which are obviously echoing very anti-Semitic discourses around blood, debt, etc. Now, what sort of critics of the Wandering Jew suggest is that by the time we get to the Romantic period, and particularly in England, where there was never a very strong tradition of the Wandering Jew, and the tradition that there was tended to be quite positive, seeing this figure as a benefactor, we're finding this figure once again removed from its kind of Jewish connotations quite frequently, being emptied out of much of its inherited significance. So Chaim Maccabee says that the Romantic writers were not interested in the sacrificial aspects of the Wandering Jew, seeing him as a victim rather than as a sacrifice. They saw him as one more example of the Romantic hero, a wandering hero isolated from normal society, expiating some crime, which in the last resort was a praiseworthy act of rebellion against a tyrannous authority. So we find the Wandering Jew becoming as a symbol in this period often connected to or part of theological critique. And the title for this slide is from one of those critiques, and it's from Percy Shelley's The Wandering Jew, which he didn't manage to publish until after his death, I think, because it was considered to be blasphemous. And his original title, I think, gives you a subtle idea of what he might have been suggesting with this poem, which is, he called it Victim of the Eternal Avenger. And in it, we have these cavillings against the unjust wrath and punishment of the divine, and this particular conception of the divine as one of wrath, one who is unjust, one who is merciless. So we have the character Paolo in Victim of the Eternal Avenger going, who is the God of mercy? Where enthroned the power to save? Reigns he above the viewless air? Lives he beneath the grave? To him would I lift my suppliant moan, that power should hear my harrowing groan. Is it then Christ's terrific sire? I have felt his burning ire. I feel it now. His flaming mark is fixed on my head. So have this idea as the sort of the marked victim of vengeance, which is greatly unjust. And we find that obviously that narrative reflected in the creature's own discussions of himself and his relationship with Frankenstein, where he says, you accuse me of murder, and yet you would with a satisfied conscience destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not to spare me, listen to me, and then if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. So this is one of the many complaints he makes about the injustice and hypocrisy of Frankenstein, who is reviling him for murder when Frankenstein would quite happily do murder himself. And this then becomes a reflection of a wider theological critique through this echoing of the Wandering Jew, where it becomes a question of a suggestion of the divine hypocrisy of a commandment not to murder, and a God who murders thousands at a time. And we also have this quasi-ironic, praise the eternal justice of man. Well, quite clearly ironic, but where is that irony aimed is perhaps a better question. So there's certainly throughout the novel an indictment of the justice of man, but this emphasis on the eternal justice of man creates that parity with divine justice, suggesting in this case that that divine justice is also hypocritical and perhaps non-existent. So the last figure, and there's only one slide for this, to fear not, is that of Cain. And we're already getting a suggestion of that coming up in The Wandering Jew. So Cain was the first murderer. He was cast out and exiled by God, but he was also marked with the mark of Cain, which was theoretically to protect him, because he says, look, if I go out, they're just going to kill me. So God says, well, I'm going to mark you so that nobody will hurt you. But then as the mythology has developed, that mark, which could be read as a sign of care in some readings, becomes an increased mark of punishment and part of his alienation from the human race. And we see this idea of the externalization of monstrosity that we find in Cain, and this idea of a pariah marked by some particular physical feature being echoed in the narrative of the monster himself or the creature himself. When I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. So in pulling from the Cain narrative as well, we're pointing towards some potentially subversive theological readings. Now, I would say within all of these texts, there is a balance quite frequently between the subversive and the conservative. And it would be difficult to say that either one of these is preferred by the text. But once we start to look at it in more detail at these intertexts themselves, we can begin to really pick apart the richness of what's going on in Frankenstein. There we go. Sorry that went over, guys. Stop recording.